What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back today to talk about my top 10 favorite movies directed by Martin Scorsese. And the reason I'm doing this is because I'm looking at all these pictures online of people lined up to see Killers of the Flower Moon at the Cannes Film Festival. And I'm just jealous. Got FOMO, fear of missing out, and all that stuff. I'm seeing all these people ranting and raving about Scorsese, and I'm like, well, goddamn, I want to talk about Scorsese. So the only way I can kind of scratch that itch is by ranting and raving about his career. And for the last couple of days, I've been kind of chipping away at some research, and I finally realized I either have to go all in and do like a 20-hour documentary, or the reverse, keep it personal and just talk about my personal experiences watching his movies over the years, because one takes about a year of work and one takes a few nights of work. So I'm not going to be repeating and regurgitating all the information that you can find on IMDb or Wikipedia or all the countless interviews that he's done over the years and all the documentaries about his career, because the one thing that those documentaries do not contain are my own personal experiences. And also, I want to start doing a lot more top 10 videos on this channel. However, I get so obsessed and so dialed in on the research that suddenly I'm like, oh my God, 3 weeks have gone by and I haven't recorded anything yet. So once again, I'm not going to summarize his entire career, but I am going to try and unlock what has made his work so special to me. Why are people so obsessed with Martin Scorsese? And full disclosure, a lot of these experiences that I had with his movies came at a time where drugs and alcohol were a big part of my life, basically high school and college. And I'm not going to say that you need to consume drugs and alcohol while watching his movies. However, they definitely don't hurt. I mean, Scorsese had some dark chapters in his life where he was just snorting lines of cocaine day and night. And there's definitely kind of an edgy, drug-fueled energy to some of his movies from the late 70s and early 80s, where I think a natural byproduct is that some of his movies are just as enjoyable, if not more so, if you have a little cocktail or a few mind-altering substances. But obviously, he's a world-class artist, and you can enjoy his films just fine in a state of total, complete sobriety. And as is always the case with any top 10 list, I'm expecting and I'm welcoming pushback on my choices. The biggest Scorsese freak that I know, Rob Cotto, he and I do not see eye to eye on some of Scorsese's movies, and that's totally fine. We do not all need to be in lockstep like some strange Scorsese cult or tribe. He's a filmmaker. He's made a wide range of movies on a wide range of topics, and not everybody's required to enjoy them in the same way. But as I've mentioned before on this channel, my biggest debt of gratitude to Scorsese is not necessarily for his films, but for his efforts when it comes to film preservation. And he's made a lot of great documentaries and sat down for countless interviews about the subject of film history. And my favorite is A Personal Journey Through American Filmmaking with Martin Scorsese, through which I discovered, I can't even tell you how many fantastic movies. So I'm going to leave a link down in the description below to a video he made like a year or so ago about the top 10 favorite movies I discovered because of his efforts as a film preservationist. But today it's all about his work, his filmography, his oeuvre. And I must admit that as I was getting prepared to record this video, I saw a few of his early short films for the very first time, which was both beautiful and sad all at once, because it means I'm rapidly running out of any fresh terrain to explore when it comes to his career as a director. And luckily, his career has been exhaustive. I mean, he's been making movies since 1959 with his first short film, which is called, I can't remember the name of it. You can't even find it online. Vesuvius 6. And I think he's purposely kind of buried it. Or maybe it's just never been made available in any way, shape, or form. But think about it. Movies have been around since more or less 1895, meaning that Scorsese's been making movies now for 64 years. So he's almost been making movies for as long as half the lifespan of the entire art form of cinema, which is just astonishing. So for me, any artist who's been making groundbreaking, interesting work for half of the entire lifespan of the art form itself, well, that is saying something. And when he pushes on to filmmaker heaven, he's going to take a giant chunk of film history with him. But luckily, we will always have the films to enjoy. But let's talk about some honorable mentions. I think most of his great feature films speak for themselves, but I do think some of his short films and documentary films have been neglected. So I want to mention those first and foremost in my honorable mentions. And let's just start with It's Not Just You, Murray, a short from 1964, which I just saw for the first time. I've been hearing him talk about it for years. I don't know why it took me so long to watch it. But on the Criterion Channel, they have a collection of early Martin Scorsese shorts from the 60s and 70s. But if you want to see kind of like the DNA of Martin Scorsese already on display and his preoccupation with some organized crime figures, the short is absolutely hysterical. What's incredible is how even as early as 1964, you'll see scenes like there's a raid by cops on a distillery. And you're like, wait a second, I've seen this before. And suddenly you realize, oh my God, like there's scenes like it in Who's That Knocking at My Door from a few years later. Or it reminds you of like the pool hall sequence in Mean Streets. Or the famous fucking beatdown in Goodfellas where Robert De Niro is just kicking a dude's face in. It's just incredible how like he was almost fully formed as an artist at a young age. He was born to do this. He was put on this earth to capture these kinds of characters, which he grew up around down basically on Elizabeth Street and Houston here in New York. And I've walked by his childhood home many times and just kind of gazed up at it in awe and wonder, thinking back on like his days as a little kid watching. It was a show called $1 Million Movie where they would play the same movie over and over and over again for I think like a week. And he famously would like lock down in front of his TV and watch Citizen Kane, like 600 times and that sort of thing. But as far as the rest of his short films go, The Big Shave is absolutely worth hunting down. But my two favorites are Italian American, where he just sits down and interviews his parents. And if you want to get a taste for life in New York from basically from the time of Scorsese's grandparents arriving in America around like 1901 up through the early 70s, and just what life was like in New York for Italian Americans, and just the interviews with Martin Scorsese's mother, Catherine, and talking about like where she learned how to cook and how she learned how to cook, and just hearing about his dad's working experiences. It's one of the most personal films you will ever see. It's fucking exquisite. But another major honorable mention is American Boy, a profile of Stephen Prince, which gets my highest possible recommendation. And it's readily available on YouTube. But if you've seen Taxi Driver, you're already familiar with Stephen Prince. He's the gun dealer that famously sells all the weapons of choice to Travis Bickle. But this little documentary is just him telling stories, and he's just one of those great raconteurs where giant heroin addict who was I think the road manager for Neil Diamond for about 2 or 3 years, but he just had all these crazy adventures, many of them involving violence and gunplay or wild animals or just people on speed. I mean, his stories are absolutely fucking bananas. And there's one famous story in there which was almost ripped off word for word by Quentin Tarantino when he made Pulp Fiction, the famous shot of adrenaline to the heart. That scene would not exist without American Boy. But speaking of short films, let's just go ahead and dive into my official top 10 list, because my number 10 is technically a short film by Scorsese, but it's his contribution to the anthology film New York Stories from 1989, but it's a film called Life Lessons. And for this movie, they lined up 3 major directors to create this anthology. They got Francis Ford Coppola, Woody Allen, and Martin Scorsese. And I really admire Coppola and I really admire Woody Allen, but Martin Scorsese just beat the pants off them with his contribution to this. It almost feels like Coppola and Woody Allen were like, fuck it, we'll just kind of do whatever and we'll just phone this in. And Martin Scorsese is like, no, I'm going to make like the best short film about art ever made. I'm going to hire the director of photography, Nestor Almendros, to shoot it. I'm going to get brilliant actors like Nick Nolte and Rosanna Arquette and Steve Buscemi to be in it. And it's just absolutely incredible. It's like pure, raw, physical artistry where you're seeing Nick Nolte at work, where he's drinking, he's smoking, he's like shooting basketball up at like the hoop on the wall and like slamming against the wall. But it's a very raw, physical performance. And he's got this big show coming up, but he's got a little case of the equivalent of writer's block. He can't paint because the love of his life / assistant is not around. But when Rosanna Arquette returns to live with him with a strict no sex rule, suddenly his art just comes to life, because he'll be sitting down there looking up at her room, obsessing over her feet, just thinking about her, just going crazy, and all this art would just start pouring out of him. It's a great kind of examination or exploration of like an artist and his muse and their kind of tempestuous, crazy relationship, because she loves tormenting him. I mean, she'll bring men home and screw him and make him listen to it. Or she'll just be walking around in just her panties, like with a bathrobe, just making him go fucking insane. I mean, it's an incredibly erotic, powerful short film. And it's safe to say that if you watch it, you'll never hear the song A Whiter Shade of Pale ever again without thinking about this movie. So definitely check it out. But let's push on to After Hours from 1985, which is my number 9. Now, as you can tell from my accent, I'm not a native New Yorker, but I've made it my home for the last 15 years. And I think it's safe to say there are many reasons why I fell in love with New York long before I ever lived here. As a kid, Marvel Comics, that was kind of my first window into New York. But then as I got older, I fell in love with the filmmaking of New York, especially when I was in high school and college in the 90s. New York was going through this golden age, this filmmaking renaissance where you had so many extraordinary filmmakers just absolutely at the peak of their powers. And a big part of that is Martin Scorsese and his depiction of this city. I mean, for years I would walk around and I would just see steam rising up through a sewer grate and be like, oh, this is just like Taxi Driver. But After Hours, not only is it funny as fucking shit, I mean, you will howl watching this movie. I think it's the best movie ever made when it comes to capturing just how weird the city gets. After Hours. I mean, it's in the name of the movie, because if you go out in New York, whether you come here for one weekend as a tourist or live here for years, if you go out on the streets late at night, you're going to see some of the craziest fucking shit that you've ever seen, and I hope that never changes. And obviously it can be a little scary and dangerous at times, but sometimes it's just like this carnival show of just absolutely bizarre human behavior that will leave you forever altered. And also, speaking of bizarre human behavior, I don't know if y'all can hear it or not, there's the 17th annual New York dance parade going on 6th Avenue, half a block away. So I'm hearing it. I don't know if it's coming through on this microphone. Hopefully the microphone is just capturing me. But if you hear a little background noise, well, that's just part of the New York experience informing and infusing this video. But I already mentioned Rosanna Arquette in Life Lessons, but goddamn, when you see Rosanna Arquette in After Hours, I mean, it'll make steam rise off your head. Your jaw will hit the floor. I mean, it's like a shotgun blast to the face. You're like, she's indescribably beautiful in this film. But Griffin Dunne, so goddamn funny. And watching Griffin Dunne's kind of straight-faced, kind of almost like stone-faced reaction to the insanity unfolding around him until finally he just comes unglued. But I feel like there have been many, many movies over the years, going back to the late 40s, that are shot in New York, that take advantage of New York, that celebrate New York. But if you have not yet seen After Hours, goddamn, you must do so. But let's move on to yet another New York movie. For my number 8, we have King of Comedy, a movie that notoriously divides a lot of people, and myself included. I remember in the 90s, my friends and I were getting really into Scorsese. We would almost kind of avoid King of Comedy on purpose. We just didn't get it or understand it or wouldn't give it a fair shot. And it took me a while to get into it because it's probably the most uncomfortable viewing experience that Scorsese's ever cooked up. But I think it's more relevant, more powerful, and more insightful than ever before, because you're dealing with a bunch of kind of unhinged characters who are obsessed with showbiz and fame and stardom. And it has this really dark, cynical beating heart right at the core of it. But if you can get on its wavelength, you'll start to realize, oh my God, this is making fun of TikTok. This is making fun of YouTube. I mean, I'm just as guilty of this behavior as anyone else. And it's making fun of any era's obsession with celebrity, and also this, the really dysfunctional, unhealthy relationship that a lot of fans can have with the stars that they admire. And probably the most telling sequence of the whole movie, Jerry Lewis is walking along, bumps into a lady who's on a payphone. She's like, oh my God, can you get your autograph? Oh yeah, sure, blah, blah, blah. Now she's like, oh, but now you need to get on the phone and you need to talk to so-and-so because you'll make their day, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, no, sorry, I've got to get to a meeting. And as he's walking off,
please, Lauren, would you just please say something to my nephew Morris on the phone? He's in the hospital.
I'm sorry, I'm late.
You should only get cancer. I hope you get cancer.
And just in the few seconds, I feel like Scorsese perfectly examines and articulates and exposes our really dysfunctional relationship between the viewing public and celebrities. But there's some scenes in this movie where your face will turn crimson with embarrassment on behalf of the characters, like when Robert De Niro is having fantasies about Jerry Lewis asking him to fill in on his show for a couple of days. Oh no, sorry, I can't do it. He doesn't want to be a great comedian or make people laugh. He wants to be a big time swinging dick. He wants to be on equal footing with his hero, where his heroes are having to ask favors of him, and that's just a really sick and twisted aspiration. And then perhaps the most uncomfortable scene you will ever see is when Robert De Niro brings a date and just shows up at Jerry Lewis's house and pretends like he's been invited and that it's totally fine. And you can see the dawning horror on the face of his date. She's like, he doesn't want us here. It's time to go. At any rate, King of Comedy, it's not for everybody, but it's definitely for me. But number 7, let's get into The Color of Money. And The Color of Money has the distinction of being my first exposure to the work of Martin Scorsese, or at least the first exposure that I can remember. But I was in a hotel room with my dad, and he was watching it on the hotel TV, and I was like reading comics or like reading D&D books, or I was distracted by something else, but every once in a while I would look up and I would see certain scenes with Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio or Tom Cruise or Paul Newman, and it made something of an impression on me, but it wasn't until college where I went back and revisited it. But long before I read The Hustler or even saw The Hustler, I'd already seen this flick many times. And I know a lot of diehard fans of The Hustler fucking hate this movie, and that's fine. Hate what you want to hate. But I make no apologies for absolutely loving this flick. And should Paul Newman have won an Oscar for HUD or Cool Hand Luke or any of the other classics he was associated with? Maybe. I mean, The Verdict, is that a better role? Probably. But I'm glad he got the statue. But there's so much to love about this movie. I think it might be my first exposure to John Turturro, and he was right on the cusp of doing a lot of incredible work with like people like the Coen brothers and whatnot. You might have the best scene that Forrest Whitaker has ever appeared in, where he's out hustling the ultimate hustler by pulling a fast one on Fast Eddie Felsen. And I can vividly recall my second year in college when I was living in a fraternity house on the top floor, and we were just blasting this movie. We were watching it on some crummy old VHS cassette, but we had it turned up basically to the point where the speakers were like coming undone from just the cacophony. And we got this kind of harsh knock on the door, and somebody was a few classes ahead of us said, there's like this historical preservation society coming by to examine the building and to make sure that we're not destroying it. Can y'all please stop smoking so much pot? There's like a cloud wafting down the stairs, and can you please turn the movie down? We're, sorry. At any rate, we were having a blast watching this movie, and I feel like it's just got this incredible just forward momentum, this incredible sense of style and atmosphere and tone, and it's just delightful watching Tom Cruise like doing martial arts moves with this pool cues as he's showing off for people while gambling. It's a fucking blast, and I definitely recommend that everybody hunt it down. But let's get out of the world of narrative filmmaking and dive into what might be the best concert film that we will ever see, The Last Waltz. And I don't know how this film would play if you don't like the musicians involved, but I think it has a good chance of turning you into a fan of the band, even if you've never heard one of their songs, because when I first saw this doc, I liked Neil Young, and I liked Bob Dylan. I liked a lot of the people that appear in it, but I was more or less unfamiliar with the band apart from the album, like Bob Dylan and the band. I think it was called like the Basement Tapes. So I had some familiarity with some of their songs. But I first saw this movie on a crummy VHS cassette my last year in college. A friend of mine and I had borrowed it from a video store where I was working called Sneaker Views in Charlottesville, Virginia. And we may or may not have been indulging in just an absolute pharmacy of various substances that were available to us. And we were just screaming in delight. We couldn't believe that no one had ever told us about this movie. We're like, how come this is not the most popular movie ever fucking made? Like, it was pre-internet ignorance. I mean, the internet was around, but I wasn't really indulging in like chat rooms about film history at that point. So as far as we were concerned, we were the first people to discover The Last Waltz. But what's incredible about this documentary is not only does it capture this incredible concert where you had all these legendary figures coming together to put on this concert, but you also have all these kind of extended documentary sequences where Martin Scorsese's interviewing members of the band about their experiences, their influences, and then periodically they'll kind of break up the film with some soundstage sequences where Scorsese's able to whip out his incredible bag of tricks, all of his incredible camera movements that he's so famous for, justifiably so. But the concert is definitely, it's very raw, and you got some of the best DPs at that time just getting some incredible footage. But when you're watching a Scorsese movie, it's not the same if you don't get to see him move the camera. So anyway, Last Waltz, I don't know how many times I've seen it, but it's a lot, and I never get tired of revisiting it. But let's get into our top 5, and this is where I expect I'll start getting some pushback, because if you're a Scorsese fan, you might say you picked the most basic, obvious 5 movies to be your top 5. But the reason they're obvious is because they're fucking good, and they have withstood the test of time. So for my number 5, I'm going with Casino. And I feel like Casino was the last time where we really got to see that classic Scorsese style where you've got organized crime figures mixed with music by people like the Rolling Stones. Obviously, Scorsese is a freak for the Rolling Stones. But there's something about those extended sequences that are just absolute. I mean, they give you a state of euphoria to watch. But I think my favorite experience watching this movie was on TV one night with my stepdad, rest in peace. And he was a giant movie freak. But as we were watching this movie, he started just howling with laughter because he'd had a lot of interesting business experiences in Vegas in the 60s and 70s. And so all these memories started coming back to him about just the attire and the behavior and the code of conduct. And so anytime I watch this movie, I think back very fondly to all the many movie experiences I had with him. But as far as what makes this movie different from a lot of other Scorsese movies, I think it's the characters played by Sharon Stone and James Woods, because I feel like through these characters, we get a great glimpse at the dark side of drug culture. And obviously, at this point, Scorsese had kind of wrestled with this demon successfully and put all that behind him. But once you've had major substance abuse issues for a long time, you never fully recover. And I feel like through these two characters, we really get a glimpse at the dark side of Martin Scorsese, and it makes the movie absolutely required viewing. But pushing on to number 4, Raging Bull. Now, I've heard from a lot of people out there that they think this movie is overrated, or that it's too serious or too grim or too relentless. That's totally fine. I love it. I love combat sports, and there are not a lot of great movies about combat sports. I mean, obviously, you've got Rocky, and you've got like The Setup, and you've got Fat City. But I think anytime you're talking about combat sports in movies, you eventually have to wrestle with Raging Bull, a movie famously about Jake LaMotta. And the subject is absolutely mean and nasty, and there are a lot of mean and nasty sequences. And this is when Scorsese was coming out of a situation where he was suffering from massive internal hemorrhaging throughout his entire body. Basically, he was bleeding out of every single orifice that he had. And while he was in the hospital recovering, Robert De Niro came to him, sat down on his hospital bed, and was like, "This book needs to be our next movie." And Scorsese just dove right in. And I think he was in the perfect place mentally to tackle this really dark subject matter. But what's really cool about it is how during the boxing sequences, every single boxing sequence employs a slightly different style. And it's like Scorsese had an opportunity here where every little technique that was in his bag of tricks got to be put on prominent display. And I feel like for people who just like the kind of flashier side of Scorsese, this movie is absolutely the motherlode, because everything he'd ever learned about filmmaking from watching movies or making movies or studying cinema, he threw it all out there. He opened up Pandora's box and would do crazy things like shooting scenes. I think it was either like an open flame or coals, but like the heat coming off was warping the image and things like that, like things that I never even fucking heard of. But I'm going to say something that might be a little controversial, but the movie's also hysterical. One of my best and only kind of spit take moments in my life. I was watching this on VHS with some friends my first year in college, and there's a bit where Robert De Niro is asking about Kathy Moriarty's character for the first time, and whether or not Joe Pesci had tried to have sex with her. Not the scene later on, the "you fucked my wife" scene, but early on, he just asked kind of out of curiosity. And the way Joe Pesci says, "I try and fuck anything," and I had a can of beer up to my lips, and I literally just went, and there's a friend sitting right next to me, and so the entire spray just went down the side of his face inside. And I'll never forget, he didn't even move. He just sat there and said, "That really sucked." Like, he had incredible self-control, but I'll never think of this movie without also remembering that bit. But also, speaking of the later scene, the notorious "you fuck my wife" sequence, it led to maybe the funniest part of Waiting for Guffman, where
I'm going to do a scene from the movie Raging Bull. You fucked my wife? What? You fucked my wife? How can you ask me a question like that? How can you ask me? I'm your brother, and you ask me that? Where do you get the balls big enough to ask me that?
And it was just absolutely fucking delightful. So Raging Bull might be too dark, too nasty, too inconsistent for a lot of people, but I think the movie is just right. But we're getting into the top 3 now, and if you're a Scorsese fan, I think the movies are going to be pretty obvious. It's just a question of in what order do I want to place these movies. But I'm going to start with Mean Streets at number 3, one of the quintessential films about New York, even though all the interiors were famously shot in Los Angeles. I mean, everything about this movie is the most grittily authentic movie about New York you could possibly imagine, but a lot of that is movie magic. A lot of that is sound stages. But I live pretty close by to Little Italy and a lot of the locations where this movie unfolds, and I never get tired of walking around those locations and just imagining Harvey Keitel and Robert De Niro just raising hell, just like, smashing trash can lids together and just having all those hysterical conversations.
Hey, wait a minute, Charlie. What? Well, you're right. I'm right. Yeah, was it last Tuesday? Yeah, that's the Tuesday that was last week. That's before the one that's about to come up.
I mean, this is one of those movies where it's easy to get tongue-tied trying to think of all the things that I love about it. I mean, it was my introduction to The Searchers. I'll never forget the first time I saw The Searchers, and when it got to the scene I was like, oh, that's the scene from Mean Streets. And anyway, I completely, totally lost my mind. But I love all these guys. They're low-level gangsters. basically hoods. But when they get a few bucks in their pocket from ripping off these kids, pretending to sell them fireworks, the first thing that pops in their head is, hey, let's go to the movies. And it's fucking delightful. But this is the first movie for me where you really get to see kind of that signature style of Scorsese on display. I mean, Who's That Knocking at My Door? It's an incredible movie, but it's with Mean Streets when you got De Niro walking into a bar to the sounds of Jumpin' Jack Flash and Keitel down at the end of the bar just drinking and watching him come in. And it's one of many Scorsese movies that ask the question, am I my brother's keeper? And Johnny Boy, or Robert De Niro's character, he's not the brother to Harvey Keitel, but he's a cousin, and he's a fuck-up, and he's getting into trouble, and he's asking for a bullet, and like, to what extent should you try and protect somebody or look after somebody? And you can trace these kinds of themes all the way back to the film Force of Evil by Abraham Polanski, a key early influence from Martin Scorsese. But Raging Bull also brilliantly explores this. But there's something about this movie that has this kind of wild, ferocious, undeniable energy where the combination of music, performance, acting, and camera moves, it all comes together to announce that a major new filmmaker is starting to take shape. And most great directors have that one movie where like, oh my God, like where they kind of have announced they've arrived. And while I love Who's That Knocking at My Door, it wasn't the major announcement that Mean Streets was. But this is one of those movies where after you've seen it, you're like, all right, whatever he does moving forward, he's going to be destined for greatness, which he confirmed only a few years later with what I think is easily one of the most groundbreaking, heavily stylized, just nightmarish movie-going experiences ever cooked up by an American filmmaker. And that would be Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver. And this is a movie that proves the power of having great collaborators, because as great as Scorsese's direction is, he's got a world-class script by Paul Schrader, one of the best screenplays ever written. You've got exquisite photography by Michael Chapman. And then you got one of the final scores by perhaps the greatest composer that the movies have ever known, and that is Bernard Herrmann. And someone's going to say, fuck you, it's Ennio Morricone. Fine, if you like Ennio Morricone, I love him too. But Bernard Herrmann, I mean, from his work with Orson Welles to Alfred Hitchcock to Martin Scorsese, everything about this movie is pure cinematic bliss. And it's probably my favorite example in film history of creating a purely subjective experience from the point of view of somebody who, I mean, to what degree he's already mad at the beginning, who can say? But as he's steadily coming unglued, which leads to my one major complaint against it. It has one scene that's not from Travis Bickle's point of view, where they kind of cheat it and they show him on the street looking up at a building, and then you go up there and it's a long scene between Jodie Foster and Harvey Keitel. And I get Harvey Keitel at this point. If you're going to put Harvey Keitel in your movie, you're going to need to give him some more screen time than just the few brief scenes that we have of sport in the flick. But it does break the internal logic of the movie if it's all going to be this warped nightmare experience from Travis Bickle's point of view. Sorry, you don't get to have any scenes of Harvey Keitel, 30 stories up from where Travis Bickle is sitting on the curb. But that's been one knock against it. Everything else, though, if you wanted to make a case for it as the most perfect cinematic experience ever made by a human being in the Western Hemisphere, I may not agree, but I'm not going to push back. It's a very special experience, and I think it's just an absolute one-of-a-kind nightmare that has been inspiring directors ever since. And the 70s were renowned for a lot of movies that gave us nightmare experiences, movies like Rolling Thunder, which Paul Schrader also wrote one of the drafts of the script. There were a lot of changes before that movie finally got made, but there's a reason why Rolling Thunder has some overlap with Taxi Driver. But when it comes to nightmarish 70s flicks, Taxi Driver will always be the GOAT. But it's time to talk about my favorite Martin Scorsese movie, and it's obvious, but I'm going with Hugo. Just kidding. Going with Goodfellas, and Goodfellas is the movie where my relationship with Martin Scorsese really started to take shape. And the first time I saw it, I didn't even know what it was. I came in like 20 minutes in, and I'd heard my parents talking about Goodfellas, which they'd seen in the theater, and they were just going berserk about it. But I didn't quite know what this was, but then I just kept catching it on HBO over and over and over again. And then I got to college and met some other maniacs who also loved Goodfellas. And I think it is a strong contender for the most stylish and entertaining movie ever made. And that sounds very simplistic, very reductive, but in the end, like, what are movies? Movies are visual storytelling experiences that give us or allow us to experience many emotions that we would not otherwise experience. But if aliens were to land in New York tomorrow and say, what are movies? What is cinema? I would be tempted to show them Goodfellas. And movie buffs and film history nerds, they have an unlikable tendency to get a little self-important and highfalutin when describing the movies they admire. And I think it's important every once in a while just to kind of bring the conversation back down to earth and like, what do you really fucking enjoy? And once you get past that, then we can discuss the craft, the fact that Martin Scorsese brought out Saul Bass to do a title sequence. I mean, is the title sequence as memorable as some of the ones that he did for like Alfred Hitchcock or Otto Preminger back in the 50s? No, but he still got Saul Bass to do a title sequence, or getting Michael Ballhaus to do his photography. I mean, oh my God, this might be the most beautiful film out of all of Martin Scorsese's filmography, and just the incredible music. I mean, when you're hearing the sounds of Eric Clapton, well, Ray Liotta is just narrating over the movie about all these people that Robert De Niro's character is having eliminated because he'd rather whack them than pay him what he owes. That might be like one of the most glorious sequences in all of movie history. This is one of those movies that has like several sequences. You're like, oh my God, that's the best the movies have ever been. Obviously, everybody loves the sequence where Ray Liotta's walking into the nightclub as the camera's just floating behind him. It's absolutely glorious. But you can't celebrate this movie without mentioning the screenplay adaptation by Nicholas Pileggi. I'm never quite sure how he pronounces his last name, but it's a film adaptation of his nonfiction book, Wise Guy. And Wise Guy is a good title, but I think that had already been stolen for a really stupid movie by Brian De Palma. Goodfellas works much better, and obviously there's that great bit or the great sequence where Ray Liotta's describing where that word comes from. Like, oh, he's one of us. He's a good fella. I mean, anyway, perfect title for a perfect movie. But if the human race were ever faced with an extinction level event where we were going to be wiped from the face of the earth and we were going to send a little like space shuttle into space carrying our greatest cultural artifacts, kind of the most beautiful things that we've ever created as human beings, and I was allowed to pick one movie to be included in that stockpile, there's a very good chance that I would pick Goodfellas. There are a lot of movies that would be in contention. I mean, The Wild Bunch would be a serious contender as well, but I could live with Goodfellas just fine. I've seen it countless times. I probably will continue to watch it countless times up until my dying day, and I just absolutely love it to pieces. But I think at this point I'm starting to ramble. I hope you've enjoyed this little list that I put together. And if you like a lot of his other movies, I mean, I haven't mentioned a single movie from the 21st century. This list stops with movies from 1995. And if you love, Wolf of Wall Street and The Departed and Silence and all these other movies of The Irishman, more power to you. I see all these movies, and I'm dying to see Killers of the Flower Moon when it comes out this fall. But for whatever reason, early 70s to mid 90s, that's my favorite period of Martin Scorsese, and I don't think that's ever going to change, no matter what, or no matter how good Killers of the Flower Moon might end up being. But I hope you enjoyed this list. If so, please hit that notification bell to be notified about future videos, and check out some of my other top 10 videos. I've created a playlist of all the top 10 lists that I've made over the years. But hope everybody, I guess, has a pleasant day looking at all the reviews and pictures coming out of Cannes about the Killers of the Flower Moon, and hopefully we won't have to wait too long before we get a chance to see it ourselves. But that's all I've got to say for now, so thank you so much for watching, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.